that's it?
Need for Speed Heat is a mix of emotions. It represents everything great and bad about racing games, and it tries a lot of new things that are really just evolutions on old things and gets them so right and in so many of the same ways so wrong that it's almost its own working, driving paradox. Everything that's wrong with Need for Speed Heat should not be wrong with the game. Everything that works great should work as expected, and it does. Yet throughout my time with this game, all I've gotten so far is the highest highs of a racing game I've played in years and the absolute lowest of lows I've played in any game this year in general. This is a franchise that needed to be turned around, a franchise that most people had turned their backs on, a franchise that has games do poorly at launch but develop cult followings like Need for Speed 2015, and a franchise that really deserves to be great and shine and be among the racing elites in this industry. What I went into this game expecting was what all the marketing created. It was the dying light of racing games. It was this risk-reward game that would make sure that you've never played anything like it when it comes to getting behind the wheel of a car, and all of that is kind of true, while at the same time, game-breaking. Need for Speed is comfortably great and terrible. But I want to start with that dying light of racing games mantra. There's this really great and in a lot of ways novel day and night mechanic in Need for Speed Heat. During the day, you race for the most part without fear of the cops. You build up cash, and that way you can use that cash to buy cars. Everything is pretty, and most of the races are much more confined. You'll see crowds gathered around. They look like sanctioned events, and they feel like sanctioned events, and the tracks are often tighter and sometimes even shorter as a result. Day racing really is a different animal than night racing. But to unlock the cars that you're going to buy with that cash and upgrade with the cash you're earning during the day, you have to race at night and raise your reputation. Racing at night is, in the best ways, totally different. This does not feel like sanctioned racing. There's no crowds cheering you on for the most part. This is night illegal street racing. And to the game's credit, it creates that atmosphere every single step of the way. The difference is at night, the police are on your tail the second they see you. And you have a heat level that acts just like Rockstar's most wanted levels, 1 through 5, with 5 being the most wanted and 1 not being wanted at all. At night, you earn reputation points as opposed to cash. And those reputation points add up, and add up throughout your single journey that night. If you get caught by police, you lose almost all of it, and you're back in your garage. There's the risk reward. All of this works super well. You have to race during the day to get that cash, but you also have to race at night in a different environment to make sure you can unlock new events, new races, and new cars to purchase. All of that's great. The heat levels, however, are not always awesome, and it's not always worth the risk at all to continue to race at night. The idea is the longer you're out, the more chases you're in with the police, the more races you run, the higher your heat level. When your heat level's 1 or 2, it's fine. The cops act normally, you can get away from them with relative ease as long as you're strategic. Everything feels great. You can continue about your race, they don't affect it all that much, but when you hit heat level 3, it's basically over. This is important because within the game, there are certain races that are called high heat races that you can only run when your heat level is at a certain point, 3, 4, or 5. But to get to 3 and race your way there, you're risking losing a lot of reputation points. And when you lose them, it feels like you've lost everything, that all that time was for waste. This would be fine if the police weren't so unbalanced and overpowered at heat levels 3 and up. They turn into tanks, and they are almost impossible to take down. They can be beaten, they can be outmaneuvered, they can be taken down, but once you start getting into the armored vehicles and the spike strips and multiple police chasing you, 4 or 5, it becomes a nightmare. It does not become very fun, and it is very, very, very difficult to get away from them. Now, that's kind of the point, right? That's the risk. You stay out later at night, you risk losing your reputation points, the police are going to be on you. That makes sense. The problem here is that a lot of content is behind heat levels 3, 4, 5. The problem here is that it isn't balanced. The spike between the cops' behavior between heat level 2 and heat level 3 is too dramatic, and it makes that risk reward much more of a just cash-in system once you get to around heat level 3. You lose almost all ambition to stay out past that heat level because you know what's going to happen. Sure, you could turn the difficulty down, but that kind of defeats the purpose of the racing. Now, all this isn't to say that this system is bad. It's not bad. It's actually awesome. It's really fun and it's enjoyable. It just needs a little bit of a balancing racing tweak to fix that spike in what you could call difficulty between the heat levels. It's definitely something EA can and probably will balance out and patch in the future. It's not something that breaks the game. But what about the racing itself? Racing in Need for Speed Heat is pretty great. It's not the best racing game I've ever played, but in terms of arcade racers, it feels wonderful. Cars have weight, drifting feels nice, tracks are diverse, the map layout is diverse, and most importantly, cars feel just right in that balance between simulation and arcade. It hits that balance perfectly. It doesn't feel like you're driving in Mario Kart, and it doesn't feel like you're playing Forza 9. It feels like you're playing an arcade racing game that understands that these are still vehicles and they still need to behave like cars. And that's a huge compliment for an arcade racing game like this. But it's also worth pointing out that this does stray, in my opinion, a little bit less arcadey than some Need for Speed games, and that may turn some people off. But when you're jumping ramps and flying over lakes, how un-arcadey can it possibly be? What's really important here to me is the customization system and the way that the racing encourages you to stick with one vehicle. Upgrades genuinely matter here. This is not a racing game where you're going to upgrade your car and not see the difference. I was able to stick with one vehicle for a lot longer than I expected simply by tuning it and upgrading it in ways that made sense. Whether it was my engine or the type of tires I was using, everything made a difference the second I took it out and raced with it again. I would run the same race twice with different upgrades, and you could see a dramatic difference in how those races played out. You can even get auxiliary upgrades that change things like the way that cops recognize you, or how often they do, or how far away they have to be. There's a lot going on under the hood here, and this allows you to develop an attachment to your vehicles. You don't always feel the need to get rid of them as quickly as you might in other racing games, and sure, you're gonna want to upgrade and try out other cars, and the good news is almost all of the cars feel as different as they can in the context of Need for Speed's driving physics. If you're looking for a game that focuses on racing, then race during the daytime in Need for Speed Heat and you're gonna get a really good arcade racer. But again, we have the exact same problem that we had with the day and night cycle. So Need for Speed Heat operates kind of like an RPG. There are levels or car ratings that determine whether or not you're capable of getting into certain races or how over leveled you're going to be in certain races. And this gating of content works fine enough. It lets you know where you're going to challenge yourself, how much you're going to be challenged, and how much you won't be. The problem is the articulation of these numbers within the actual AI and within the actual races does not come across as smooth or obvious at all. I can jump into one 220 rated race and have a totally different environment than another 220 rated race when it comes to difficulty and when it comes to the way my car performs in them. The problem with this, again, is balancing. Once you're in these races, even when you're looking at the levels of these races, things go one of two ways almost all the time. You're either going to be absolutely destroying your competition, hundreds and hundreds, sometimes even thousands of yards in front of them by the time the race is over, or you're going to be destroying all of your competition except for one car, which will be 400 yards in front of you, driving at speeds that you couldn't fathom a NASA rocket reaching. To Need for Speed Heat's credit, there's not any rubber banding here that I have noticed, but there's just a total lack in balancing of the AI, where the game is either dramatically too easy, or one single car is just so much faster than everybody around it that it becomes an impossibility beating them if there isn't a crash. But again, these are sliders, these are code, these can be fixed, and they probably will be fixed, tweaked, and changed as the months go on, so while it isn't perfectly balanced now, it'll probably be in the future, or at least better. But what really stood out to me was Palm City. Most of my family lives in Miami. I grew up in that area. It is probably the place outside of Manhattan I am most familiar with in the entire world. Palm City in Need for Speed Heat is a fictional Florida locale, and this is an open world racer, but what it really is an open world racer that takes place in a Miami, not hindered by having to be accurate to that actual city. Everything about Palm City screams Miami, from the actual palm trees, the beach, the stark white architecture, downtown, even some swampier areas. It is very much a microcosmic articulation of that city, and it's awesome, and it is diverse. You're going to come across, like I said, downtown and the beaches, but you also come across farmhouses and suburban areas and shipping docks. Palm City is one of the more wonderful open world locales that I've had in a Need for Speed game, and sure, I might be a little biased, but its perks lean into its gameplay as well. There are a lot of things to see and do and find in Palm City. There are a ton of collectibles, whether it's crashing into flamingos, finding street art. Every collectible in the game, every map marker leads to something important, which is not something you can say for a lot of open world games. Crash into all the flamingos, you get yourself a supercar. Find the street art, you get to use that when it comes to customizing your vehicles. Complete all the speed traps, and you get yourself another supercar. The density of Palm City in terms of things to find and do is spot on. This world is not too big. It's actually borders sometimes on a little bit smaller than you'd expect, but this works for this particular game. It's got its ramps, its billboards to crash through. It's a good time when you're not racing, which is so important with these kinds of games. But there's also a drawback to Palm City. Need for Speed Heat is not the prettiest racing game you're going to play. Not this year, and certainly not this generation. Need for Speed Heat looks fine. Running it on Ultra on PC, it looks good. It's not a bad looking game by any means, but a lot of textures won't load in. The fidelity of the game is not top notch. It's fine. However, what does stand out are the weather effects, which are gorgeous in this game and dynamic. For example, in the blistering rain, sometimes you'll drive across a building and suddenly your windshield won't be plastered with rain anymore because the building is blocking that rain based on where the rain is coming from and the way the wind is blowing. Your tires will kick up that water. Puddles will reflect. It rains a lot in Miami. It rains a lot in Florida, it rains a lot in Palm City, and it's the most beautiful way, day or night, to experience this game. But this is a modern Need for Speed game, so we have to talk about something that's usually awful, but surprised me here a little bit, which is story. Yes, this is a Need for Speed game, which means in 2019, we have to have a story attached to our driver. The good news is this year, you can pick what your driver looks like, which is not new to racing games. You can see them regularly, watch them speak, have them walk around. Cutscenes treat your player less like an avatar and more like a human being with thoughts, emotions, and a voice. No matter what franchise you're talking about, it's sometimes rare to see that in racing games. And I thought this was going to be something that bothered me, like it almost always does when games attempt to do these things. But I'm going to say something that I did not expect to say, which is the story is not awful here, actually at all. It's very cops and robberish, it's very Crooked 5-0, CSI Miami. We had to have a story, so here you go. But in the context of all that, it's pretty fun. Some of the characters that are supposed to be villains are genuinely menacing and genuinely terrifying. The people on your side are human beings that feel like human beings. Sometimes they'll say things like "suck my stinky," spoiler, which I heard early in the game, but for the most part they talk like real human beings. Their heritage is addressed. The main characters are Cuban. They'll sometimes slip into Spanish, sometimes they'll speak English. The point is, it all feels real. It feels like this is a world that exists, a city that's a place, and characters that are people, and that is more than I can say for 90% of racing games with stories. Now, I will also say that if you were to synthesize the story into the written word, it would not set the literary world on fire. It wouldn't be picked up as a script at Fox, and it wouldn't be turned into a movie. This is not one of those video games can't have great stories thing. This is one of those EA made a Need for Speed game, and its story is not going to be on the level of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. But it was fun, and it was enjoyable, and it was something that I'm actually kind of glad I got to experience, even in its absolute lows. I know not everybody's going to agree with me on this, and I certainly don't think you should buy the game for its story, but what I will say is that it was an enjoyable time for me. But finally, I want to get to the part that really probably matters to a lot of you, which is where does the game falter? Need for Speed Heat is a good game, but it does have quite a few things holding it back. We've talked a bit about the police balancing and the race balancing, but both of those things can probably be fixed and probably will be fixed pretty easily. In fact, there may even be some people that disagree with my assessment of these functions. But I think some of the problems with Need for Speed Heat lie in the way that it has you progress throughout its campaign or game. It does kind of treat itself like an RPG, gating content behind levels, and this is fine, but oftentimes it leads to you rerunning the same races over and over again, specifically at night and specifically in the early game, and it becomes tedious. And when you do this early in the game, even if it lets up a little bit towards the end and towards the middle of it, that tedium takes its toll. I'm not super stoked the third time I'm running the same race to get the same reputation points I lost because I got caught by the police because I couldn't get past 5 of them with a heat level of 3 in my last time out at night. I'm especially not stoked to do that when I'm absolutely destroying all of my competitors by 1,000 yards, sometimes as much as a mile. With all that being said, I'm also not a giant fan of how it locks away cars. Sometimes you'll get cars for free simply for reaching certain reputation points or milestones. Other times you'll have to buy them with cash. And with all of these systems, there's a lot of, I guess, what I would call grind, which you don't often see in racing games. Depending on how you play it, depending on what you're here for, that grind may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing. If you're someone that's excited by the story and wants to see more of it, that grind may very much so become annoying. If you're someone that wants to complete every race, a grind may not exist at all. But again, with this game, it feels like there's a balance that could have been met somewhere that definitely wasn't here. And finally, I do want to point out the technical state of the game. I did not run into a lot of glitches, which is a credit to Need for Speed Heat. I think other people have been running into some glitches from what I've seen, but I did not, so I'm not going to report that I did, because that wouldn't be true. But I will say that loading times coming into the game and coming out of it are incredibly long, at least on PC. PC, and by incredibly long, I mean unacceptably long. Getting to the main menu or the lobby from the story menu, for example, can take up to 2 minutes. That's to get to a different menu. However, credit where credit is due. Other than that, I don't want to reward a game for working because it should, but it is worth pointing out that it does.
Sorry, it's just a little too much bullshit this early in the day.
Look, I'm actually surprised by Need for Speed Heat. I had a lot more fun with this game, and I'm having a lot more fun with this game than I expected to. So much so that I'm going to continue to play it until I've seen and done everything the game has to offer, more likely than not. However, I am going to wait a couple of weeks before I do that. Mostly because I think there's going to be some AI balancing patches that come in, and some of the nuance of the game feathered down to make more sense in the context of its mechanics. And at that time, when the game's smallest problems are fixed, I think this could actually be a great game. I don't know how other people are going to feel about it. Racing games are so unique in that every single person wants a different kind of game. Some people want more arcadey, some people want less, some people want bigger worlds, some people want smaller, some people only care about customization. And with that being said, I'm not going to sit here and recommend the game to you, mostly because I don't know which of those people you are. But what I will say is that this was kind of the Need for Speed game for me in a lot of ways. It absolutely has problems, 100%. And if these problems do not get fixed, I don't recommend spending a dime on it. And maybe with even more time with the game, I'll start to sour on it, but for now, I'm actually looking forward to driving through Palm City. Oh, and as of today, the game is not filled with microtransactions, so let's leave on a good note.
Got a car? Yes, sir.
Yes, officer!
Well guys, that is it for today's video. As always, I want to know what you think. Does this sound like the Need for Speed game that you're interested in? What is your favorite Need for Speed game? And then I think the question I'm more interested in is, what is your favorite racing game of all time? I'm going to answer any of those questions down in the comments below. Let's have a real conversation. As always, if you enjoyed this video, press that like button. If you've not yet done so, press subscribe as well. I put out more videos each and every week. That way you won't miss any. Also, there's a little button, a little bell next to the subscribe button. I say this every video, but that little bell, all it does is make sure you're actually notified when I upload a video. That bell is super small, but also super important. So press subscribe and a little bell. Also, as I work on Red Dead and towards Death Stranding, helping me out as I get through my pieces on those games. Jordan Fringe, if you appreciate his editing prowess, he has a channel too. His channel's name is called Batteries Low. Check him out. And until next time, guys, I'm out.